Hello everyone and welcome back to the F2 show by Inside F2. We are back, Formula 2 cars were back on track this weekend in Melbourne and I for one absolutely love seeing the cars back on the track. Joining me to reflect on the first round of the season, we have a guy who is so old he remembers watching Fangio in the second tier of Motorsport. Aaron Harper. Aaron, how are you? And are you as tired as me? Is that a good starting point?
Yeah, I think we're all pretty exhausted. We're just running on vibes in this podcast. So you could get some sense, you could get chaos, and you could get everything in between. So have fun, everybody.
And joining him is a guy who is so young. He wasn't even a teenager when Oscar Piastri won the championship in 2021. I'm joking, of course. Of course he was. Martin Lloyd, how are you, my friend? And you joining the Tired Club on the podcast today?
Yeah, I absolutely am. Stayed up for the race and had to get something out straight after talking about the cancellation or canculation, I think, as the broadcast said. It was an interesting few days, but looking forward to talking about it.
Yeah, let's get into it then. Obviously, no feature race to discuss as the feature race was cancelled. Spoiler alert, but there's still plenty of talking points on track and off track. Let's start with, as I said at the top, it kind of was overshadowed by a couple of things happening off track. But let's start with the drama going into the weekend before we even saw cars on track. 3 teams, Rodin, Dams and Trident, all penalised following the pre-season test. There were infractions. The 3 teams were hit with €10,000 fines per car. Drivers from all 3 teams were hit with 10-place grid penalties for both races, and then also losing a day of testing in the in-season test. That was for drilling holes in the diffuser to convey the airflow beneath the pipeline of the sensor pressure, modifying a standard part. Whatever that means, I am not technical in any way. But yeah, obviously not a great way to start the weekend before cars had even hit the track, Aaron. What were your thoughts?
It was quite a shock, really, because we're very used to breaking news on a Wednesday or a Thursday ahead of a Formula One race weekend with a driver being replaced or something happening. It's almost unheard of in Formula 2. And for something so severe to happen, it was quite surprising, quite a shock to read what had been done. And I feel like Formula 2 acted in the only way it could. And some people may see the punishments as quite strong, and I think they're basically saying, look, you can't do this. This is just not on. And I understand that they're going to sort of try and level the playing field in a future test for the other teams. But looking at the track action, I don't think it had a huge impact, but also it's a spec series, so we can't have teams trying to be sort of sneaky in a way. You have to have rules, and they're there. They have to be enforced like the law. If you break the law in public, you can get punished. So the teams were dealt a punishment. They've served their punishment now, and we can sort of leave it behind and move on.
Martin, agree? Do you think the penalties were fair to penalise them in a race weekend? I think it's important to note as well, this wasn't just in pre-season. I think there were a few people saying, it happened in pre-season testing. Why should it carry over into a race weekend? The reason it's carried over into a race weekend is because there was an unfair advantage gained in the pre-season test for the race weekend, right? So do you think the penalty was fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the advantage gained, there was data gathered on these sensors that were put in the diffusers. And if we look into the minutiae of the detail of which rules were broken, so Article 1.5.2 of the technical regulations doesn't allow any alteration of parts issued by the FIA with the diffusers being modified. Teams under 8.4.10 aren't allowed to install any sensors without writing to the governing body, and no sensors can protrude from the car under Article 8.4.11. So that's 3 important rules that the 3 teams have broken, and I agree with Aaron. I think I don't see what else F2 could have done in this situation.
Yeah, we want the integrity of the series to be maintained, don't we? So I'm glad that the penalties have been dished out, and hopefully those teams will won't do it again. Hopefully that's that's the outcome from this. Aaron, obviously there's going to be implications as well for the in-season test, aren't there, coming up?
Yeah, so the teams can apply to have the sensors attached to their car, and in their decision, the stewards said that the stewards, the FIA, the people running the test can approve applications from the 7 teams that weren't sort of punished for this, but they are to reject applications from Dams Lucas Oil, from Trident, and from Rodin Motorsport, who were all the 3 teams punished in this instance. And I think that's sensible, because it just gives everybody else an opportunity to gain the same data. Whether they do or not is a different question, but the opportunity is there to do so. So in that sense, it kind of balances the playing field. Or it's at least an attempt to, because you're never quite sure what data has or hasn't been gathered. So yeah, I think they've done everything they can. They've looked at the rules, they've enforced them as they can. They've attempted to almost reimburse the other teams, if you're thinking in a financial sense. So, yeah, I think they've done the right thing. I think everyone will have learnt their lesson, and I think the series will actually be stronger for it, because when teams do go testing, they'll know, although they should already, they'll know what they can and can't get away with, and what the punishment will be if you're found guilty.
Agree, Martin?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you said, Fraser, it's about the integrity of the championship and making sure that it's equal for all teams. And I think where we have this test in Bahrain in a couple of weeks, it's a good opportunity to be able to allow the other teams to also gather this data. And like Aaron says, if a team does try to do something like this again, well, firstly, they'll be punished, and secondly, they won't get any outstanding advantage after it. So I think it's a strong message being sent by the championship, and I think it's the right thing to do.
Okay, just to confirm as well that those 10-place grid penalties were for the drivers will not be carried over into the next round at Bahrain. Those penalties were for Melbourne only. So you could actually argue, Aaron, that they've kind of got away with it a little bit. You could kind of argue that in the race that the big points are dished out in, right?
Yeah, there's a bit of a grey area there, because they issued they publish the grid beforehand, don't they? And the drivers are then sort of shuffled back according to the penalties. So in that sense, it's officially been served, but practically, in terms of actually starting the race, you could claim it's not been served. But I've never seen that situation then roll over to another race, not even in Formula One. So I think we just say that it's done, we move on, the teams have served their punishment, and we go racing again in Bahrain in a month's time. And that seems like far too long. I want more Formula 2 action next weekend. Can we go to China, please?
That'd be good, wouldn't it? Formula 2 cars in China. As you say, should we talk about the on-track action? Because that is the reason we love this brilliant series, isn't it? It's the first time that Formula 2 have kicked off in Australia. What did you make of the season opener in Melbourne, Martin?
Yeah, I thought in terms of the on-track action, it was definitely a pretty chaotic event, but I think there's a few drivers that we need to talk about here. So starting with the obvious, Joshua Dirksen, I think he was obviously one of the standout surprise drivers of last year. But actually, you look at this season, he had the racecraft last season, and you look at him on Saturday morning, and he was outstanding. He beat the reigning Formula 3 champion by 2.2 seconds. He was driving the car that was the car that won the Formula 2 Teams and Drivers' Championship last year. These are no mugs. It's Luke Browning who was third. It's Richard Verschoor who's the most experienced driver in the championship who was fourth. It was a really difficult field that was closing up on Dirksen, and he was able to weather any storm perfectly. The safety car restarts were absolutely fine, and I think this is proving any doubts that was Josh Dirksen. Just were his wins last season, were they by luck? Did he got a couple of podiums? Was that just because the AAX car was particularly good that weekend? No, I think Dirksen's here to stay. I know he said to you in pre-season, Fraser, that perhaps there could be a title challenge on. I wouldn't quite go that far yet, but I'm really pleased for Josh that he's been able to carry some form into the start of 2025.
Totally agree. I think he really controlled that race, didn't he, Aaron? There was at no point, difficult. There was stoppages. There was a couple of safety cars that he had to deal with, and he built up a gap, and the gap was gone after the safety car. But there was never actually a point where I thought he was going to lose the lead to Fornaroli. He was in total control, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. He made the absolute most of Australia, despite its 4 DRS zones being still quite tricky to overtake. It's quite narrow. It's the corners coming onto the straights are slightly peculiar. The braking zones are short in places, and for turn 9, basically non-existent, which is ironically at the end of the longest DRS straight. So it was very difficult for anybody to affect a pass on another car, especially in DRS train. And Martin, you mentioned about the safety car restarts. Joshua Dirksen absolutely nailed them. He pulled out the advantage. He gapped them. He got rid of the DRS threat, and he took off. And it was comfortable. I mean, we've seen in the past Australia in this configuration and in its old configuration as well back in the day, it can throw up absolutely crazy races full of incidents and chaos. And it wasn't quite that this time in the sprint race, but there was still a couple of safety car restarts to contend with, and that's always tricky because I've seen safety car restarts go wrong in Australia. David Coulthard in 2002, I think it was, just driving off the circuit. As he
was that? I think that was before I was born. But
now I feel very old. So yeah, I've seen it happen at this very circuit. Drivers can get it wrong, and for a young man who is relatively new to this sort of level of racing. Obviously, he's got a year of experience, but making that jump from FRECA to Formula 2, it's a big jump. And he showed last year that he can cope at the front, put some doubters in their place. And I know he said it about a championship challenge. Well, he's leading the championship right now. If the series was to end today, they could never race again. Joshua Dirksen would be the 2025 Formula 2 champion, but still a long way to go.
So it's one race, Aaron. Let's calm down. It's one race.
The Josh Dirksen hype train is here. I'm on it. I am driving this train.
All aboard. Yeah, love that. Martin, any other standout performers in the sprint race on Saturday? I think Leo Fornaroli, on debut, a little podium there, and a maiden podium for Luke Browning as well. They're probably 2 drivers that stood out, right?
Absolutely. I think in terms of Fornaroli, this is a guy who won a championship last year without winning a race. So maybe we shouldn't have been surprised that he was absolutely fine sitting in behind Josh Dirksen. Obviously, he'd like to have won the race, but second place for Fornaroli is what he's used to. That's absolutely fine for him. And I think if that's the way that he's going to start the season on debut, then this could be a really good year for him. Then you look at Luke Browning in third, who said before the season started he wants to go for both titles. So that's a very good way to go about it. And we saw Dino Beganovic this weekend in the other high-tech was very quick. Yes, he span in the sprint race, but he's kept up that form that was kind of almost surprisingly impressive in the Dams, considering how he'd not quite thrived in F3 in the way we'd expected him to. But he came into the Dams last season and was really good, and he seems to have that pace again this year. I think the other 2 drivers I'd like to bring up are Sebastian Montoya and Gabriele Mini. In terms of Seb, he's a driver who we spoke about pre-season, who might have a bit more to him speed-wise than meets the eye in terms of his results. And I think we saw that in terms of 6th place in his first race. Not too shabby at all. And Gabriele Mini, who would have been on pole if not for the penalty for impeding Jack Crawford, finishing 7th, taking the point for the fastest lap. I think he could really be one to watch this season, and perhaps a bit more than that.
Definitely. We're going to get on to Gabriele Mini losing his pole position a bit shortly. Aaron, agree with those? Any other standout drivers for you? Sebastian Montoya was a real standout, wasn't he? It was a great performance by him after all, but it was a difficult qualifying session. He only got a decent lap in at the end of the session, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, both Premers went really well in the race. Obviously, Sebastian Montoya moving forward up to P6, which is a good result for him after a slightly tricky qualifying session. Obviously, Gabriele Mini losing pole position, so he started the sprint from 13th. It's just a weird, quirky way in the way they apply the penalties there. But again, he was super impressive. A couple of the overtakes he pulled off, I thought, wow, we have got a real talent on our hands here. This guy is super quick. Part of the Alpine Academy, and they are chock full of reserve drivers. They cannot get enough of them. So, take a ticket at the counter with Gabriele Mini and wait for your number. So, who else would I point out? I want to give a shout out to Roman Stanek. He had his only Formula 2 win so far in his career at Melbourne last year in the sprint race. And again, another good performance on the Albert Park streets, because P5, in a team where there were questions raised over him joining them, but the team said, look, we know what he's capable of. And I think he showed that. He qualified in the top 10, finished our one and only race in P5. That's decent points. He was not far off of his teammate, who is the reigning Formula 3 champion in Fornaroli. So, I think for a first weekend up against a new opponent in a new team, he's done very, very well there. So I'd like to see more of that, please, Roman Stanek.
Yeah, definitely good performances there. I totally agree. I think the other standout performance for me was Alex Dunn. Obviously started in P16, made his way up to P9. I spoke to Luke Browning in a press conference after the sprint race on Saturday, and he alluded to the fact that it is seriously difficult to overtake around Melbourne. I think a few of them were really struggling to overtake or to find that opportunity to overtake, particularly at the front. But yeah, Alex Dunn, absolutely not one of those drivers. As I said, moving from P16 to P9. Gabriele Mini, another one of those drivers moving through the field as well. Good drive by him, and P5 in qualifying as well, Martin. That's good going for Alex Dunn on debut,
Absolutely. I think Alex Dunn, sometimes you see drivers who go to Formula 3 with a big profile and Formula 3 doesn't quite suit them, and then they come into Formula 2 and actually, I don't know about winning championships, but they win a few races, they get a few podiums, and actually Formula 2 is a championship in terms of being still very chaotic, but slightly less everywhere, a little bit more strategy based. Sometimes it suits drivers. And I think maybe that could be the case with Alex Dunn. He qualified really well. And like you say, he came through the field. I'd be really interested to see what he could do in a feature race from fifth position, because as we've seen for many, many years, the talent is absolutely there with Alex. He's backed by the McLaren Academy, and last season didn't go quite as he'd have wanted with MP, I think it was, in Formula 3, but I think he could really be one to look out for this season in Formula 2 if he can keep up performances like that, because Rodin, as we know, is a strong team.
Just see that comical moment, Aaron, in the feature race where he had to push his own car in the pit lane.
Shades of Nigel Mansell there. I didn't actually see that, but because I saw that the race was cancelled, and I thought, well, there's no point trying to watch the highlights, because very sadly there was none. But yes, so that's, you never quite know what you're in for when you get to Formula 2. It could be on-track action, it could be ducks on the side of the road, or it could be drivers pushing their cars down a soggy pit lane.
Absolutely. So obviously, let's talk about the feature race. As you say, no action, unfortunately. A few laps behind the safety car, but no representative running. So just to clarify, no points were handed out in the feature race. Victor Martins does, however, keep his 2 points for pole position. That was an inherited pole position after he inherited that from after Gabriele Mini was penalised for blocking Jack Crawford and impeding him. And I was interested by that, because we've seen in the past that penalties like that have only applied for the feature race, and he was penalised for both races, Martin. I don't know what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting decision, and I think it's where we've got a championship where we have got 2 races. I think it might be quite a good decision if we think that there's a penalty deserved, and I think that might be part of the thinking in terms of the 10-place penalties as well. I think with Gabriele Mini, I was talking to Jack in the press conference after qualifying, and he actually said he didn't know really what else Gabriele could do. But I think if you're going to apply a penalty, feature races are realistically where the points are being handed out. If you've got Gabriele starting 13th rather than 10th in the sprint race, and that's the only penalty, or if you think he's hurt someone else's lap, then I would agree with this, Stuart. I think maybe something else could be done. So I think 3 places, it's not going to wreck someone's race completely. And I think to apply it to both races, if something has been done that's wrong, I don't mind that at all. I think that's a good decision.
Aaron, agree, disagree?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because of the way the weekend is sort of formatted, you've got the sprint race followed by the feature race. I absolutely agree that a penalty in qualifying should apply to the feature race, because we've seen it, let's say Monaco, where drivers have an accident, innocently enough, they have an accident and they end up protecting their pole position. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think Jack Crawford was about to go and take pole position, but it's the pole sitter. He's impeded another driver. The rule is fairly clear cut on that. So for it to affect his feature race grid start, absolutely spot on. The grey area here for me is the sprint race. And I've been sort of weighing it up in my head because the thing is, if you start them further back in the sprint race, yes, they've got fewer chances to score points perhaps. Whereas if he was starting in the reverse pole position of 10th, he could still go and score points. He could still go and score points from 13th, which he did. So, yeah, it's a slightly interesting way of going about it. I think the premise of it is sound. It's just sort of, yeah, how it interacts with the other the broader championship picture in terms of, is both races too harsh? Is that fair? It's tricky because the thing is you get an offence in the sprint race and it only affects maybe the feature race as a grid drop. So there's a little bit of a crease to iron out there, I think. But in terms of applying penalties and sort of laying down the law of motor racing, I think it's fine because it shows that penalties, transgressions will be punished and you can't sort of navigate around them. It will affect both of your races, which I think is fair. But the sprint race situation maybe needs just a little bit of sort of clarification in terms of the way it impacts the whole weekend. But look, if it's the same for everybody gets the same punishment in terms of 2 races affected, I think we can't say fairer than that.
Cue the stewards giving a one-place or a penalty for one race in a couple of weeks' time in Bahrain, and then we'll all be talking about that on this podcast.
We'll be scratching our heads saying, we could do it better.
Of course.
Side us up. We'll be the stewards for the weekend. Numerous teams were unfortunately affected by some electrical issues during qualifying. Leo Fornaroli was one that was affected. He confirmed in the press conference. Arvid Lindblad was affected. There was a few more as well. We had a shakedown on Saturday morning ahead of the sprint race to make sure that those electrical issues were gone. There might have been one or two who are still struggling in the sprint race if you go by a few rumours. So, yeah, for me, when drivers are paying an awful lot of money to race in the series and every weekend could be career defining, it's not really what you want to see, is it, Martin? It's a shame for some of those drivers.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think when you look at, like you say, let's face it, the series is based in Europe, and you're flying out to Australia, and it looks like everything went relatively smoothly at testing, and it happened. It's really not ideal. It's something that I think the championship is looking to get on top of, and I was pleased to see that although there were issues, there was proactive action being taken in terms of bringing in the shakedown on Saturday morning. So I think it's a really difficult situation for the drivers, like I say, because they're flying a long way. But I guess mechanical issues are part of motorsport. I think we've seen it maybe quite a lot in F2 in the last few years, and it's just a case of if the championship can continue to be proactive about it, then I think it's a step in the right direction at least.
Aaron, agree?
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think the proactive action on the part of Formula 2 was very interesting because, to make myself sound really old again, it's sort of a throwback to back in the day where Formula 1 had a session on a Sunday morning called the warm-up, where this is before teams were locking in setups ahead of qualifying. They could test a setup ahead of a wet race or something. So, a specific tyre or something before they committed to it. That was when Formula 1 looked and sounded very, very different. But it was very sort of on the front foot this weekend from Formula 2, wasn't it? With the penalties to the 3 teams for their pre-season testing transgressions, the shakedown session in terms of ironing out electrical issues. Martin said technical issues are part of the game, sadly. And yeah, in a spec series, it's not ideal to have sort of that fluctuation in unreliability, but it's going to happen. So I think, when it's something like maybe a standard part, then, or it's an issue that's affecting multiple drivers across the same weekend, I think that was positive to see Formula 2 sort of listening to what's going on, working out, can we fit something in here? And also, from a fan's point of view, at the circuit, it's extra track action. I don't know if the fans were at the circuit when the cars went round, but an extra 30 minutes of Formula 2 cars on track, sign me up.
Makes up for the lack of running in the feature race, doesn't it? So maybe they did get there.
Maybe they should take the timing results from that to award the points retrospectively.
25 points to the person who went fastest in the shakedown. I think there'll be a few drivers who didn't go a bit faster in the shakedown if that was the case. Okay, classic Aaron, by the way, referencing a motorsport back in the day. We'll be talking about T-cars in a bit. Do you remember what they are? Do you remember T-cars, Martin, or was that before your time as well?
It was before my time, but that's a spare car, is that right?
Yeah,
that is a spare.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope it's a spare car, otherwise I look really silly.
Yeah, so Michael Schumacher had full conglomeracy over the Ferrari one. It was always set up for him. And there was races. If you listen to, I don't know if I can get away with this, producer James, but bring back V10s by the race. They're always talking about spare cars, and someone would jump into the spare car and do the Grand Prix in it. They wouldn't use their race car. It was wild. But
I seem to remember Brundle and Herbert running back.
We have gone wildly off topic. We have in 90, just to carry on just for a second. In '98, when there's that massive crash at Spa at the start of the race, there was however many 8, 9, 10 retirees, and 4 or 5 of them went and jumped in the T car and carried on in the race. So there wasn't as many retirements as what it actually looks like. So
some of those meant their teammate couldn't take part.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, I think Eddie Irvine jumps in the Ferrari, which was obviously set up for Michael Schumacher, wasn't it? So anyway, we have gone massively off topic with that. Speaking of, I guess F1 history and someone who's been around a little while, did you see that either of you see the photo of Alex Jakes watching Formula 2 from the paddock? It must have been a weird feeling for him watching it and not commentating on it, right?
It must have been like, that's my child. It's grown up and it's gone to university. What's going on? Like a proud dad.
Yeah, exactly that. Cracking job by Chris this weekend, though Martin, no?
Absolutely. I think Chris did a great job, and we've seen that in the last couple of years when he's been on F3 and when he's been subbing in for Alex in F2. I think we all knew Chris would do a great job because we've seen him, we know him, we've seen him do a really good job the last few years. I think that it's you don't want to be patronising because I've never been a commentator, but I really wouldn't want to fill for a couple of hours when there's just nothing happening. Or there's a slow motion replay of some ducks again. Great, so massive respect to Chris, and I think it actually made me think of when I remember watching F2. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago. I think it was Austria 2020, and there was we had actually quite a lot of light left, so it was Jakes and Brundle filling for 2 or 3 hours, and I think we did actually get the sprint race in that day. So I can kind of link to both Alex and Chris there as well. I think Chris did a really good job this weekend.
Definitely not an easy weekend to jump in the commentary box for the first time on a full-time basis as well, with so much going on. He has actually sent us a little voice note with his 60-second summary for the weekend. Let's do it.
Formula 2 weekend, first round of the season. Great to see the cars back in action more than anything, and great to see the drivers really put through their paces this weekend. I think a couple of main takeaways that I had from it was that we saw Joshua Dirksen and AIX Racing putting themselves down as serious title contenders straight away. Some people would not have put them into that conversation and maybe overlooked their wins from last season, but they showed straight away that they should be taken seriously for this. Likewise, Leo Fornaroli as well, showing why he won the Formula 3 Championship last year with yet another podium. Victor Martins, a real shame for him, but a pole position to start. Gabriele Mini, very good pace. If we're going to talk about disappointments, I think Campos Racing, their pace was just really missing this weekend, and I think they'll look to address that in the test before we return for Bahrain and Jeddah. So those were my main takeaways. I think there were definitely some teams that were missing, but some teams that really turned up, and the main star of the show, AIX Racing and Joshua Dirksen, which Lewis Hamilton even congratulated.
Okay, that's what Chris thought then. A few things to take away from that, guys. I guess Josh Dirksen, he agrees with you, Aaron, potentially a title contender. And I think that's a good point. We haven't spoken about Campos, actually. Campos had a bit of a disappointing weekend, didn't they, Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, they started last season, and, well, they were, for most of last season, very, very strong. And people were tipping them to be the leading team again. They'll be disappointed with their results from Australia, but it's a slightly unique layout in the way it sort of comes together. So there's still plenty of points on the table, and Arvid Lindblad and Pepe Marti will be chomping at the bit to get back in the car in testing, get prepared for Bahrain and Jeddah, and put some big points on the board, because they know that there could be a seat available at Racing Bulls potentially this season, definitely next season, I would think. So put themselves in the shop window and make Mr. Marco take notice.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about Helmut Marko after his comments this weekend that were utterly ridiculous, by the way. Martin, agree about Campos?
Well, firstly, I agree about Helmut Marko's comments. Yes, in terms of Campos, it was a really difficult weekend for them. I think I've been writing up a piece trying to kind of summarise the weekend for FIDA Series, and I'm finding it, it's tricky to kind of take away too many pace or like pecking order implications from this weekend, just because there were so many variables in terms of who had grid penalties, who was affected by the electrical issues. We don't know who was affected in terms of incidents. Like I mentioned earlier, Dino, the two Tridents spinning out. I think it's difficult to figure out who is where on the grid, but I think certainly the first weekend of the season, Campos would have expected a lot more given how much pace they had last year. Given that I was tipping them in the preseason predictions podcast, I hope that they improve, and to be honest, I'm sure they will, because they're a very good team.
Absolutely, I'm sure they'll bounce back very quickly. Just a quick word from you both on our Formula 1 graduates, or our Formula 2 graduates into Formula 1. Tough weekend for a lot of them, but standout, I guess, Kimi Antonelli. Aaron, is that a fair assessment?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we saw it last year at Silverstone. You saw it firsthand. You were there on the ground for us. So he has just that lovely touch and feel in the wet conditions. He was aided by Mercedes making the correct strategy calls, timing his pit stops perfectly. They overturned the 5-second penalty that he got for an unsafe release. So, he keeps that P4. Disappointing weekend for Oliver Behrman. The Haas car not looking as competitive as we would have hoped. Felt so sorry for Isaac Hadjar.
Yeah.
But actually, I thought it was a brilliant moment that Anthony Hamilton, his son has had all the success in the world and could yet go on to have even more with the most famous Formula One team. And yet he's taken the time to go and find this young man who's just had, he's obviously so excited, but it's the most devastating thing he's had in his career. I mean, at the end of last season, the guy didn't get off the line when he was fighting for the Formula 2 title. And this manages to top it. I felt so sorry for him, but Anthony Hamilton taking the time to go and sort of comfort him and remind him that he's got a long career ahead of him and that there's plenty more to come. I thought that was a really nice, touching moment and reminds you of the sort of human side of motorsport. So, yeah, obviously very disappointing for Isaac. Not so great either for Jack Doohan and Liam Lawson and Gabriel Bortoletto, all failing to finish. But it's the first race weekend. It was a tricky race. Even old school pros like Fernando Alonso found a way to put it in the barrier, so they weren't alone. They'll just have to sort of chalk this one off, move on to China next weekend, and hope that it doesn't rain, because that place can be tricky too.
Yeah, Martin, they'll bounce back, won't they? They're all good enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually there are a lot of drivers who have been in F2 in the last couple of years who maybe haven't got the chance to race in F1. You look at Teo Porcher, you look at Fred Bestie. These are guys who are good enough for Formula 1 and they didn't get there. So I'm pleased we've got so many there. And I think it was a difficult start, but when you're on a street track, when you're driving a Formula 1 car for the first time in the wet, like you say, Aaron, with Fernando Alonso crashing out, with Jack and Isaac dipping a tyre on the white line, with Liam being on slicks on a wet track. I know he had a difficult weekend as well, but I think it was a real baptism of fire for the guys. I think that the one guy who really shone through, the one rookie, was Kimi Antonelli, as you said. And we spoke actually earlier in the podcast about overtaking at turn 9, about how it's the longest DRS zone on the track, about how it was the shortest braking zone. Lewis Hamilton, who is personally the person that got me following F1 however many years ago, 15 years ago, couldn't pass the Williams, which was very quick, of Alex Albon around turn 9 for the whole first half of the race. Kimi Antonelli goes and does it, takes 4th place. Outstanding. I think there's a lot more to come from Kimi. As you said, Aaron, at Silverstone last year, I was with Fraser and we were just sat there watching him go away from the field. Every time there was a safety car, he was a few seconds clear within a lap or two. It was unbelievable, and I think we know that there's a real talent in there, and I'm really excited to see what he can do for the rest of the season.
I think it's a message to all the sort of doubters, isn't it? You need to believe the hype about this guy. Yes, his Formula 2 season wasn't the swashbuckling runaway championship, but actually Formula 2 isn't just about winning the championship. It's about showing that you're ready for Formula 1. And with that performance in Silverstone and the 3.5 laps we got in Spa before it was red flagged, he's shown.
I see that Colapinto overtake probably every other day because it is so good and people repost it. So that just shows it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, there's lots to come from all of those drivers in Formula 1 this year. Okay, that's all we got time for today. If you've enjoyed the show, please make sure you go and give it a like, subscribe for more Formula 2 content this season, and get involved in the conversation as well on YouTube, on our social media channels. We want to hear your thoughts and opinions. Make sure you leave them in the comments below and we'll read them out before Bahrain. But from me, Fraser Ford, and all of us here at Inside F2, we'll see you next time.